This audiovisual material was produced and published by 100 Books Collection.
Practice daily. Do your research and change your life for the better. Invisible Helpers. Charles Webster Leadbeater. Chapter 1. The Universal Belief in Them. One of the most beautiful features of theosophy is that it restores to men, under a more rational form, all that was really useful and profitable to them in the religions they have outgrown. Many who have passed through the chrysalis of blind faith and have ridden upon the wings of reason and intuition into the freer and nobler mental life of higher levels, feel, however, that in the process of this glorious gain something has been lost, that in abandoning the beliefs of their childhood, they have also given up much of the beauty and poetry of life. If, however, their lives in the past have been good enough to earn the opportunity of coming under the benign influence of theosophy, they very soon discover that even in this particular there has been no loss at all, but an exceedingly great gain, that the glory, the beauty, and the poetry are there in greater measure than they had ever before expected, and no longer as a mere pleasant dream from which the cold light of common sense may rudely awaken them at any moment, but as truths of nature which bear investigation, which become brighter, fuller, and more perfect as they are more accurately understood. A notable example of this beneficent action of theosophy is the way in which the invisible world, which, before the great wave of materialism engulfed us, used to be regarded as the source of all living help, has been restored by it to modern life. All the charming folklore of the goblin, the brownie, and the gnome, of the spirits of the air and water, of the forest, the mountain, and the mine, is no longer meaningless superstition, but has a basis of real and scientific fact. His answer to the great fundamental question, "If a man dies, shall he live again?" is equally definite and scientific, and his teaching on the nature and conditions of life after death throws a flood of light on many things which, at least to the Western world, were previously shrouded in impenetrable darkness. It cannot be repeated enough that in this teaching on the immortality of the soul and life after death, theosophy stands in an entirely different position from that of ordinary religion. In speaking of these subjects, we are not dealing with pious opinions or metaphysical speculations, but with solid and definite facts, as real and as near to us as the air we breathe or the houses in which we live, facts of which many of us have constant experience, facts among which are the daily work of some of our students, as will be seen later on. Among the beautiful conceptions which theosophy has brought back to us is first of all that of the great useful agencies of nature. The belief in them has been worldwide from the earliest dawn of history, and is universal even now, outside the narrow domains of Protestantism, which has emptied and darkened the world for its votaries by its attempt to do away with the natural and perfectly true idea of intermediate agents, and reduce everything to two factors, man and deity, an artifice by which the conception of deity has been infinitely degraded, and man has remained unaided. A moment's reflection will show that the ordinary view of providence, the conception of an erratic interference on the part of the central power of the universe with the result of its own decrees, would involve the introduction of partiality into the scheme, and hence of the whole series of evils which must necessarily follow on its heels. The theosophical teaching, according to which a man can only be helped especially when his past actions have been such as to merit this help, and that even then the help will be given through those who are comparatively near his own level, is free from this serious objection. And furthermore, it brings us back to the older and far grander conception of an unbroken ladder of living beings, extending from the Logos itself to the very dust beneath our feet. In the East, the existence of invisible helpers has always been recognized, though the names given and the characteristics attributed to them naturally vary in different countries. And even in Europe, we have had the old Greek stories of the constant interference of the gods in human affairs, and the Roman legend that Castor and Pollux led the legions of the rising republic in the Battle of Lake Regillus. These stories have their legitimate successors in medieval accounts of saints who appeared at critical moments and turned the fortunes of war in favor of the Christian hosts, or of guardian angels who sometimes intervened and saved a pious traveler from what would otherwise have been certain destruction. Chapter 2. Some modern cases. Even in this incredulous age, and amidst all the whirlwind of our 19th century civilization, in spite of the dogmatism of our science and the deadly dullness of our Protestantism, instances of intervention inexplicable from the materialistic point of view may still be found by anyone who will take the trouble to look for them. And to demonstrate this to the reader, I will briefly epitomize some of the examples given in one or other of the recent collections of such stories, adding one or two which have come to my knowledge. A very notable feature of these more recent examples is that the intervention seems almost always to have been aimed at helping or saving children. An interesting case that occurred in London only a few years ago concerned the preservation of the life of a child in the midst of a terrible fire, which broke out in a street near Holborn and completely destroyed two of the houses there. The flames had so taken hold of the houses before they were discovered that the firemen were unable to save them, but succeeded in rescuing all the inhabitants except two, an old woman who died of suffocation from the smoke before they could reach her, and a child about 5 years of age, whose presence in the house had been forgotten in the hurry and excitement of the moment. The mother of the child, it appeared, was a friend or relative of the mistress of the house, and had left the little creature in her charge during the night, because she herself had been obliged to go to Colchester on business. It was not until all the others had been rescued, and the whole house was engulfed in flames, that the landlady remembered with a terrible pang the trust that had been confided to her. It seemed useless then to attempt to reach the garret where the child had been laid, but one of the firemen heroically resolved to make the desperate effort, and after receiving minute directions as to the exact situation of the room, plunged through the smoke and flames. He found the boy and brought him out completely unhurt, but when he rejoined his companions he had a very singular story to tell. He stated that when he reached the room, he found it in flames, and most of the floor already collapsed, but the fire had curved the room toward the window in an unnatural and inexplicable manner, such as he had never seen before in all his experience, so that the corner in which the child lay was entirely intact, although the very joists of the fragment of floor on which his cot was lying were half burned. The child naturally was very much terrified, but the fireman stated clearly and repeatedly that when, at great risk, he went to him, he saw a form like that of an angel. Here his exact words are given, something gloriously white and silvery, bending over the bed and smoothing the bedspread. He could not possibly have been mistaken, he said, for it was visible in a blaze of light for a few moments, and in fact disappeared only when it was within a few feet of him. Another curious feature of this story is that the boy's mother was unable to sleep that night in Colchester, but was constantly haunted by a strong presentiment that something was happening to her son, to the extent that she was at last compelled to get up and spend some time in earnest prayer that the little boy might be protected from the danger which she instinctively felt hovering over him. The intervention was evidently what a Christian would call an answer to prayer. A theosophist, putting the same idea into more scientific phraseology, would say that her intense outpouring of love constituted a force which one of our visible helpers was able to use to rescue her child from a terrible death. A remarkable instance in which children were abnormally protected occurred on the banks of the Thames, near Maidenhead, a few years before our last example. This time the danger from which they were saved came not from fire, but from water. 3 little ones, who lived, if I remember rightly, in or near the village of Shottersbrook, were taken for a walk along the towpath by their nurse. Suddenly, as they rounded a corner, they rushed upon a horse pulling a barge, and in the confusion, 2 of them got the wrong tow line and fell into the water. The boatman, who noticed the accident, went forward to try to save them, and found that they were floating in the water in a rather unnatural way, as he said, and moving calmly toward the shore. This was all he and the nurse saw, but the children stated that a beautiful person, all white and shining, was beside them in the water, held them and guided them to shore. Their story was not without corroboration, for the boatman's little daughter, who ran from the cabin when she heard the nurse's cries, also stated that she saw a beautiful lady in the water, dragging the 2 children to shore. Without fuller details than the story gives us, it is impossible to say with certainty from what kind of helpers this angel came, but the probabilities are in favor of her having been a developed human being functioning in an astral body, as will be seen when we later deal with this subject from the other side, so to speak, from the point of view of the helpers and not the helped. The well-known clergyman Dr. John Mason Neale relates a case in which the agency is somewhat more clearly distinguishable. He relates that a man who had recently lost his wife was visiting with his young children at the country home of a friend. It was an old mansion, and in the lower part there were long, dark passages in which the children played with great delight. Two of them told how as they were running down one of these passages, they met their mother, who told them to come back and disappeared. The investigation revealed the fact that if the children had run only a few more steps, they would have fallen into a deep, uncovered pit that opened up in their path, so that the appearance of their mother had saved them from almost certain death. In this case, there seems to be no reason to doubt that the mother herself was still lovingly watching over her children from the astral plane, and that, as has happened in other cases, her intense desire to warn them of the danger into which they were so recklessly rushing gave her the power to make herself visible and audible to them for the moment, or perhaps simply to impress their minds with the idea that they saw and heard her. It is possible, of course, that the helper may have been another person, who adopted the familiar form of the mother so as not to alarm the children, but the simplest hypothesis is to attribute the intervention to the action of maternal love itself, ever awake, undimmed by the passage through the gates of death. This maternal love, being one of the holiest and most disinterested of human sentiments, is also one of the most persistent on the higher planes. It is not only the mother who is on the lower levels of the astral plane, and therefore still in contact with the earth, who maintains her interest and care for her children as long as she can see them. Even after her entrance into the heavenly world, these little ones remain the foremost objects of her thought, and the wealth of love she lavishes upon the images she makes of them. There is a great outpouring of spiritual force that flows down upon her offspring, who are still struggling in this lower world, and surrounds them with living centers of beneficent energy that cannot inappropriately be described as true guardian angels. An illustration of this is found in the 6th of our theosophical manuals, page 38. Not long ago, the little daughter of one of our English bishops was walking with her mother in the town where they lived, and in carelessly running down a street, the child was run over by the horses of a carriage which rushed upon her as she turned a corner. Seeing her between the horse's legs, the mother rushed toward her, expecting to find her badly hurt, but the child rose cheerfully, saying, "Oh, Mamma, I am not hurt at all, for something dressed in white kept the horses from stepping on me and told me not to be afraid." A case which occurred in Buckinghamshire, somewhere in the vicinity of Burnham Beeches, is remarkable on account of the length of time during which the physical manifestation of the relief agency seems to have been maintained. It will have been seen that in the cases hitherto given, the intervention was a matter of a few moments, whereas in this one, a phenomenon occurred which seems to have persisted for more than half an hour. Two of the young children of a small farmer were left to amuse themselves while their parents and all their family were engaged in harvest work. The little ones went for a walk in the woods, wandered away from home and got lost. When the weary parents returned in the evening, they discovered that the children were missing, and, after inquiring at the houses of some neighbors, the father sent servants and hired hands in various directions to look for them. Their efforts were fruitless, however, and their cries were unanswered, and they had gathered back at the farm in a somewhat dejected mood when they all saw a curious light some distance away, moving slowly across some fields toward the road. They described it as a large globular mass of an intense golden glow, very different from the light of ordinary lamps, and as it drew nearer they saw the two missing children walking steadily in its midst. The father and some others immediately ran toward it. The apparition persisted until they were close to it, but just as they seized the children it vanished, leaving them in darkness. The children told how when night came on, they had wandered crying in the woods for some time, and at last lay down to sleep under a tree. They were awakened, they said, by a beautiful lady with a lamp, who took them by the hand and led them home. When they asked her, she smiled at them but said not a word. Both adhered firmly to this strange tale, without it being possible in any way to shake their faith in what they had seen. It is to be noted, however, that although all present saw the light and noticed that it illuminated the trees and hedges that came within its sphere, precisely as an ordinary light would, yet the form of the lady was visible to none but the children. Chapter 3. A Personal Experience. All the above accounts are relatively well known and may be found in some of the books containing collections of such accounts, most of them in Dr. Lee's More Glimpses of the World Unseen, but the two cases I am going to relate have never been published before, and both occurred within the last 10 years, one to myself and the other to a very dear friend of mine, a prominent member of the Theosophical Society, whose accuracy of observation is beyond a shadow of a doubt. My own story is simple enough, though not unimportant to me, for the interposition undoubtedly saved my life. I was walking one extremely wet and stormy night along a quiet lane near Westbourne Grove, struggling with little success to hold an umbrella against the wild gusts of wind, which threatened every moment to tear it from my hands, and trying to think over the details of a job in which I was engaged at the time. Suddenly, a voice I know well, the voice of an Indian teacher, shouted in my ear, "Get back!" And obeying mechanically, I jerked violently backward almost before I had time to think. As I did so, my umbrella, which had swung forward with the sudden movement, was snatched from my hand, and a huge metal chimney pot crashed to the pavement less than 3 feet in front of my face. The great weight of this object and the tremendous force with which it fell make it absolutely certain that, had it not been for the warning voice, I would have been killed on the spot. However, the street was empty, and the voice was that of someone I knew to be 7,000 miles away from me, as far as the physical body was concerned. This was not the only occasion on which I received help of this supernormal kind, for in my early life, long before the founding of the Theosophical Society, the apparition of a loved one who had recently died prevented me from committing what I now see would have been a serious crime, although in the light of the knowledge I then possessed, it seemed to me not only a justifiable, but even a laudable act of retaliation. Again, at a later date, though still before the founding of this society, a warning transmitted to me from a higher plane, in the midst of impressive surroundings, enabled me to prevent another man from embarking on a course which I now know would have ended disastrously, though at the time I had no reason to suppose so. It will be seen, then, that I have some personal experience which strengthens my belief in the doctrine of invisible helpers, even apart from my knowledge of the help which is constantly given at the present time. The other case is much more striking. One of our members, who gives me permission to publish his story, but does not wish his name to be mentioned, once found himself in very serious physical danger. Owing to circumstances which need not be detailed here, she found herself in the very center of a dangerous street altercation, and seeing near her several men lying down and evidently badly wounded, she had the momentary expectation of meeting the same fate, as escape from the crush seemed altogether impossible. Suddenly she experienced the curious sensation of being whirled out of the crowd, and found herself standing, unharmed and quite alone, in an alley parallel to that in which the uproar had taken place. She still heard the noise of the fight, and while she was wondering what had happened to her, 2 or 3 men who had escaped from the crowd came running to the corner of the street, and on seeing her expressed great astonishment and pleasure, saying that when the brave lady disappeared so suddenly from the midst of the fight, they had been certain that she had been shot down. At the time, no explanation of any kind was given her, and she returned home much puzzled, but when she later mentioned this strange occurrence to Madame Blavatsky, she was informed that, her karma being such as to enable her to be saved from her extremely dangerous position, one of the masters had specially sent someone to protect her, in view of the fact that her life was necessary to the work. However, the case remains extraordinary, both because of the great amount of power exercised and because of the unusually public nature of its manifestation. It is not difficult to imagine the modus operandi. She must have been bodily lifted above the intervening block of houses and simply deposited in the next street. But as her physical body was not visible floating in the air, it is also evident that a veil of some kind, probably of etheric matter, must have been placed around her while she was in transit. If it be objected that whatever can conceal physical matter must itself be physical and therefore visible, it may be replied that by a process familiar to all students of occultism, it is possible to bend the rays of light, which, under all conditions at present known to science, travel only in straight lines unless refracted, so that after passing around an object, they may resume exactly their former course, and it will be seen at once that if this were done, such an object would be absolutely invisible to all physical eyes until the rays were allowed to resume their normal course. I am fully aware that this statement alone is enough to brand any observation as nonsense in the eyes of the scientists of today, but I cannot help it. I am merely stating a possibility of nature which the science of the future will doubtless someday discover, and for those who are not students of occultism, the observation must wait until then for its justification. The process, as I say, is quite comprehensible to anyone who understands a little about the more occult forces of nature, but the phenomenon is still excessively dramatic, while the name of the heroine of the story, if I may be permitted to give it, would be a guarantee of its accuracy to all my readers. Since the publication of the first edition of this book, another recent case of interposition, perhaps less striking but entirely successful, has been communicated to me. A lady, obliged to undertake a long railroad journey alone, had taken the precaution of securing an empty compartment, but just as the train was leaving the station, a disgusting and villainous-looking man leaped in and seated himself at the other end of the carriage. The lady was greatly alarmed to find herself alone with so dubious a personage, but it was too late to call for help, so she remained seated and earnestly commended herself to the care of her patron saint. Soon her fears were redoubled, for the man rose and turned toward her with a malevolent smile, but she had scarcely taken a step when she recoiled with a look of the most intense astonishment and terror. Following the direction of his glance, she was startled to see a gentleman seated directly opposite her, gazing silently but steadily at the bewildered thief, a gentleman who certainly could not have entered the carriage by any ordinary means. Too astonished to speak, she watched him as if fascinated for half an hour. He uttered no word and did not even look at her, but kept his eyes fixed on the villain, who cowered, trembling in the far corner of the compartment. The moment the train reached the next station, and even before it stopped, the thief yanked open the door and hurried out. The lady, deeply grateful to be rid of him, turned to express her gratitude to the gentleman, but found only an empty seat, although it would have been impossible for any physical body to have left the carriage at that moment. The materialization lingered in this case for a longer period than usual, but otherwise expended no force in action of any kind, nor indeed was it necessary for it to do so, as its mere appearance was sufficient to carry out its purpose. But these stories, all referring to what would commonly be called angelic intervention, illustrate only a small part of the activities of our invisible helpers. Before, however, we can profitably consider the other departments of their work, it will be well for us to have clearly in our minds the various classes of entities to which it is possible that these helpers may belong. This, then, will be the part of our subject which we shall treat of next. Chapter 4. The Helpers. Help may come from various kinds of inhabitants of the astral plane. It may come from the devas, from nature spirits, or from those we call the dead, as well as from those who act consciously on the astral plane during life, chiefly the adepts and their disciples. But if we examine the matter a little more closely, we shall see that although all the classes mentioned may, and sometimes do, take part in this work, yet their shares in it are so unequal that it is practically left almost entirely to one class. The very fact that much of this helping work has to be done on or from the astral plane accounts in large part for this situation. To anyone who has a slight idea of what powers are really available to an adept, it will be obvious that for him to work on the astral plane would be a far greater waste of energy than for our leading physicians or scientists to spend their time in breaking up stones in the road. The work of the adept is in the higher regions, chiefly in the arupa levels of the devachanic plane or celestial world, where he can direct his energies to influence the true individuality of man, and not the mere personality, which is all that can be attained in the astral or physical world. The force he exerts in that more exalted realm produces greater, more far-reaching and more lasting results than can be achieved by expending even 10 times the force he employs here below. And the work he does up there is such that he alone can fully accomplish it, while that of the lower planes can, at any rate, be achieved to some extent by those whose feet are still upon the first rungs of the great ladder, which will one day lead them to the position on which he stands. The same remarks apply also to the devas. Belonging as they do to a higher kingdom of nature than ours, their work seems for the most part wholly foreign to mankind, and even those of their orders, and there are some, who respond at times to our higher longings or callings, do so on the mental rather than on the physical or astral plane, and more frequently in the periods between our incarnations than during our earthly lives. It may be recalled that some instances of such help were observed in the course of investigations into the subdivisions of the devachanic plane which were undertaken when the Theosophical Handbook on the subject was in preparation. In one case, a deva was found teaching the most wonderful celestial music to a chorister, and in another, one of a different class was giving instruction and guidance to an astronomer, seeking to understand the form and structure of the universe. These two are but examples of the many instances in which the great kingdom of the devas has aided evolution and responded to the higher aspirations of man after death. And there are methods by which, even during earthly life, these great beings may be reached and infinite knowledge acquired from them, though even then, such a relationship is obtained rather by rising to their plane than by invoking them to descend to ours. In the ordinary happenings of our physical life, the deva very rarely interferes. In fact, he is so fully occupied with the far grander work of his own plane that he is probably hardly conscious of it, and while it may occasionally happen that he becomes aware of some human sorrow or difficulty which excites his compassion and moves him to endeavor to help in some way, his larger vision undoubtedly recognizes that at the present stage of evolution, such interpositions would, in the great majority of cases, produce infinitely more harm than good. There was undoubtedly a period in the past, in the infancy of the human race, when it received much more help from outside than it does at the present time. At the time when all its Buddhas and Manas, and even its most ordinary leaders and teachers, came from the ranks of deva evolution or perfected humanity from a more advanced planet, any such help as we are considering in this treatise must also have been provided by these exalted beings. But as man progresses, he becomes enabled to act as a helper, first on the physical plane and then on higher levels, and we have now reached a stage where humanity should be able to provide, and to some extent does provide, invisible helpers for itself, thus releasing for still more useful and higher work those beings who are capable of it. It is thus evident that such help as this can be rendered by men and women who are at a particular stage of their evolution, not by adepts, since they are capable of much grander and more amply useful work, and not by the ordinary person without special spiritual development, since he could be of no use at all. As these considerations lead us to expect, we find that this helpful work on the lower astral and mental planes is mainly in the hands of the disciples of the masters, men who, though still far from attaining the status of adepts, have evolved to the point of being able to function consciously on the planes in question. Some of them have taken the further step of completing the links between the physical consciousness and that of the higher levels, and thus have the undoubted advantage of remembering in waking life what they have done and what they have learned in those other worlds. But there are many others who, though still unable to carry their consciousness uninterruptedly, by no means lose the hours when they think they are asleep, but employ them in noble and unselfish work for their fellow men. In what this work consists, we shall proceed to consider it, but before entering upon that part of the subject, we shall refer to an objection which is very frequently raised in regard to such work, and we shall also deal with the comparatively rare cases in which the agents are nature spirits or men who have left the physical body. Persons whose understanding of theosophical ideas is as yet imperfect often doubt whether it is permissible for them to try to help anyone whom they find in sorrow or difficulty, lest they interfere with the destiny which has been decreed for him by the absolute justice of the eternal law of karma. Man is in the situation in which he finds himself because he has deserved it. He is now realizing the perfectly natural result of some evil he has committed in the past. What right have I to interfere with the action of the great cosmic law by trying to improve his condition, either on the astral or physical plane? Now, the good people who make such suggestions are really, if only unconsciously to themselves, exhibiting the most colossal conceit, for their position involves two startling assumptions. First, that they know exactly what another man's karma has been, and how long he has decreed his sufferings to last. And secondly, that they, the insects of a day, could absolutely override the cosmic law and prevent the due fulfillment of karma by any action of their own. We may be sure that the great karmic deities are perfectly capable of managing their affairs without our help, and we need not fear that any action we take may cause them the slightest difficulty or discomfort. If a man's karma is such that he cannot be helped, then all our well-intentioned efforts in that direction will fail, though we shall nevertheless have gained good karma for ourselves by making them. What the man's karma has been is none of our business. Our duty is to give help to the utmost of our power, and our right is only to the act. The result is in other and higher hands. How can we know how a man's account stands? For all we know, he may have exhausted his bad karma, and be at this moment at the exact point where a helping hand is needed to relieve him and bring him out of his trouble or depression. Why should we not have the pleasure and privilege of doing that good deed as well as another? If we can help him, then that fact alone proves that he has deserved to be helped, but we can never know unless we try. In any case, the law of karma will take care of itself, and we need not worry about it. There are few cases in which the spirits of nature render aid to mankind. Most of these creatures shun the abodes of man and retire before him, because they dislike his emanations and the perpetual bustle and unrest he creates around them. Moreover, except for some of their higher orders, they are generally inconsequential and thoughtless, more akin to happy children playing in extremely favorable physical conditions than to serious and responsible entities. It sometimes happens, however, that one of them becomes attached to a human being and does him many favors. But at the present stage of their evolution, this department of nature cannot be relied upon for anything like constant cooperation in the work of the invisible helpers. For a fuller description of the nature spirits, the reader is referred to the 5th of our theosophical manuals. On the other hand, help is sometimes rendered by the recently deceased, that is, by those who still remain on the astral plane and in close touch with earthly affairs, as probably in the above-mentioned case of the mother who saved her children from falling into a well. But it will readily be seen that the amount of such help available must naturally be exceedingly limited. The more altruistic and helpful a person is, the less likely he is to be found after death, remaining in full consciousness on the lower levels of the astral plane, from which the earth is more easily accessible. In any case, unless he be an exceptionally bad man, his continuance in the realm from which alone any interference would be possible would be comparatively short. And though from the celestial world he may continue to exert a benign influence upon those whom he has loved on earth, it will usually be rather of the nature of a general blessing than of a force capable of producing definite results in a particular case, such as those we have been considering. On the other hand, many of the departed who wish to help those they have left behind find themselves totally unable to influence them in any way, for to work from one plane upon an entity in another requires either great sensitivity on the part of that entity or a certain amount of knowledge and skill on the part of the operator. Thus, while cases of apparitions shortly after death are by no means uncommon, it is rare to find one in which the deceased person actually did something useful or succeeded in impressing what he wished upon the friend or relative whom he visited. There are such cases, of course, many of them, when we put them all together, but they are not numerous compared with the great number of ghosts who have succeeded in showing themselves. The help given by the dead is therefore usually scanty. Indeed, as will be explained later, it is much more often the case that they themselves need help than that they can give it to others. At the present time, therefore, most of the work to be done in this regard falls to living persons who are able to function consciously on the astral plane. Chapter 5. The Reality of Superphysical Life. It seems difficult for those who are accustomed only to the ordinary and somewhat materialistic lines of thought of the 19th century to believe in and fully realize a condition of perfect consciousness apart from the physical body. Every Christian, at any rate, is bound by the very fundamentals of his creed to believe that he possesses a soul. But if the possibility is suggested to him that such a soul might be a thing real enough to become visible under certain conditions apart from the body, either during life or after death, the chances are 10 to 1 that he will tell you scornfully that he does not believe in ghosts, and that such an idea is but an anachronistic survival of an exploded medieval superstition. If, therefore, we wish to understand the work of the band of invisible helpers, and perhaps learn to assist in it, we must free ourselves from the shackles of contemporary thinking on these subjects and try to grasp the great truth, now a proven fact for many of us, that the physical body is in truth but a vehicle or garment of the real man. He permanently sheds it at death, but he also sheds it temporarily every night when we go to sleep. In fact, the process of falling asleep consists of this very action of the real man in his astral vehicle slipping out of the physical body. I repeat once more that this is not a mere hypothesis or ingenious supposition. There are many among us who are able to perform, and perform every day of their lives, this elemental act of magic in full consciousness, who pass from one plane to another at will, and if this is clearly understood, it will become apparent how grotesquely absurd the ordinary and unreasonable assertion that such a thing is utterly impossible must seem to them. It is like telling a man that it is impossible for him to fall asleep, and that if he thinks he has ever done so, he is under a hallucination. Now, the man who has not yet developed the link between the astral and physical consciousness is unable to leave his denser body at will, or to remember most of what happens to him while he is away from it. But the fact is, nevertheless, that he leaves it whenever he sleeps, and can be seen by any trained clairvoyant hovering over it or wandering at a greater or less distance from it, as the case may be. The undeveloped person floats, as a rule, near his physical body, scarcely less asleep than the latter, and comparatively formless and incipient, and it is found that he cannot be removed from the immediate vicinity of that physical body without causing him serious discomfort, which would, in fact, awaken him. As man evolves, however, his astral body becomes more definite and more conscious, thus becoming a more suitable vehicle for him. In the case of most intelligent and cultured people, the degree of consciousness is already very considerable, and a spiritually developed man is as fully himself in that vehicle as in this denser body. But although during sleep he is fully conscious on the astral plane and can move freely there if he wishes, it does not mean that he is ready to join the band of helpers. At this stage, most people are so absorbed in their own line of thought, usually a continuation of some line taken in the waking hours, that they are like a man in a brown study, so absorbed that he pays practically no attention to everything going on around him. And in many respects it is well that this is so, for there are many things on the astral plane that might be bewildering and frightening to one who did not have the courage born of full knowledge of the true nature of all that he is about to see. Sometimes a man gradually awakens from this condition, awakens to the astral world around him, so to speak, but more often he remains in that state until someone who is already active there takes him in hand and awakens him. This is not, however, a responsibility to be undertaken lightly, for while it is comparatively easy to awaken a man on the astral plane, it is practically impossible, except by a most undesirable exercise of mesmeric influence, to put him to sleep again. Before, therefore, a member of the band of workers thus awakens a dreamer, he must be absolutely certain that the man's disposition is such that he will make good use of the additional powers, which will then be placed in his hands, and also that his knowledge and courage are sufficient to be reasonably sure that he will suffer no harm as a result of the action. The awakening thus realized will place the man in a position to join, if he so desires, the band of those who help humanity. But it should be clearly understood that this does not necessarily or usually bring with it the power to remember in waking consciousness anything that has been done. That capacity has to be attained by man for himself, and in most cases it does not come until years later, perhaps not even in the same lifetime. But, happily, this lack of memory in the body in no way prevents work outside the body, so that except for a man's satisfaction in knowing during his waking hours what work he has been engaged in during his sleep, it is not a matter of importance. What really matters is that the work is done, not that we remember who did it. Chapter 6. A timely intervention. However varied this work on the astral plane may be, it is all directed to one great end, the furtherance, in whatever humble degree it may be, of the processes of evolution. Occasionally, it is connected with the development of the lower realms, which it is possible to accelerate slightly under certain conditions. Our leading adepts clearly recognize their duty toward these lower kingdoms, elemental as well as animal and vegetable, for in some cases their progress only takes place through their connection with or utilization by man. But naturally, the greater and more important part of the work is connected with mankind in one way or another. The services rendered are numerous and varied, but they relate mainly to the spiritual development of man, physical interventions, such as those related in the first part of this book, being very rare. They do occasionally occur, however, and while it is my desire to emphasize rather the possibility of extending mental and moral help to our fellow men, it may be well perhaps to give 2 or 3 instances in which friends personally known to me have rendered physical aid to those who urgently needed it, in order that it may be seen how these examples of the helper's experience fit in with the accounts given by those who have received supernatural help. Such stories, I mean, as are found in the literature of so-called supernatural occurrences. In the course of the recent rebellion in Matabeleland, one of our members was sent on a mission of mercy, which may serve as an illustration of the manner in which help has occasionally been rendered on this lower plane. It seems that one night, a certain farmer and his family in that country were sleeping peacefully in supposed safety, not realizing that only a few miles away, relentless hordes of savage enemies were on the prowl maturing diabolical plots of murder and rapine. Our associate's task was to awaken the slumbering family somehow or other to perceive the terrible danger that so unexpectedly threatened them, and she did not find it at all easy. The attempt to impress upon the farmer's brain the idea of impending danger failed utterly, and as the urgency of the case seemed to demand vigorous measures, our friend decided to materialize long enough to shake the housewife by the shoulder and urge her to get up and look about her. The moment she saw that she had succeeded in attracting attention, she disappeared, and the farmer's wife has never been able to find out from that day to this who of her neighbors so opportunely awakened her, thus saving the lives of the whole family, who but for this mysterious intervention would have been slaughtered in their beds half an hour later. She cannot even now understand how this needy friend managed to get in when all the windows and doors were so securely locked. Being awakened so rudely, the housewife was inclined to regard the warning as a mere dream. Nevertheless, she got up and looked about her, only to see that all was well, and it was fortunate that she did so, for although she found nothing unusual inside, she had scarcely opened a blind when she saw the sky red with a distant conflagration. She immediately roused her husband and the rest of the family, and thanks to this timely warning, they were able to escape to a nearby hiding place just before the arrival of the horde of savages who destroyed the house and ravaged the fields, but did not get the human prey they expected. You can imagine the feelings of the rescuer when she read in the newspaper, some time later, an account of the providential deliverance of this family. Chapter 7. The Angel Story. Another case of intervention on the physical plane which occurred a short time ago makes a very beautiful little story, although this time only one life was saved. It needs, however, a few words of preliminary explanation. Among our group of helpers here in Europe, there are 2 who were brothers long ago in ancient Egypt, and who are still very much attached to each other. In the present incarnation, there is a great difference in age between them, for one is in the maturity of life, while the other was then a mere child in the physical body, though an ego of considerable progress and promise. It naturally falls to the elder to train and guide the younger in the occult work to which they are so sincerely devoted, and as both are fully conscious and active on the astral plane, they spend most of the time during which their grosser bodies are asleep, working together under the direction of their common master, and rendering both the living and the dead such aid as is within their reach. I will quote the story of the particular incident I wish to relate from a letter written by the elder of the 2 helpers immediately after it occurred, for the description therein is more vivid and picturesque than any third-person account could be. We were engaged in other business when Cyril suddenly cried out, "What is that?" For we heard a terrible cry of pain or fright. In a moment we were on the spot and discovered that a boy of about 11 or 12 years of age had fallen down a cliff to some rocks and was badly hurt. He had broken a leg and an arm, the poor fellow, but what was even worse was a terrible cut on his thigh, from which a torrent of blood was gushing. Cyril shouted, "Let's help him quickly or he'll die." In emergencies of this kind, you have to think fast. It was clear that two things had to be done: stop the bleeding and get physical help. I was obliged to materialize Cyril or myself, for we wanted physical hands at once to tie a bandage, and besides it seemed better that the poor boy should see someone on his side in his trouble. I thought that, although he would doubtless be more at ease with Cyril than with me, I could probably procure help for him more easily than Cyril, so that the division of labor was obvious. The plan worked to perfection. I materialized Cyril instantly, he doesn't know how to do it himself yet, and told him to take the scarf from the boy's neck and tie it around his thigh and twist a stick through it. "It won't hurt him much," said Cyril, but he did so and the blood stopped gushing. The wounded boy seemed half unconscious and could scarcely speak, but he looked at the bright figure bending so eagerly over him and asked, "Are you an angel, Master?" Cyril smiled so beautifully and replied, "No, I am only a child, but I have come to help you." And then I left him to comfort the sick man while I ran to fetch the child's mother, who lived a mile away. What it took me to get the conviction into that woman's head that something was wrong and that I must go and see what was the matter is incredible. But at last she put down the frying pan she was cleaning and said aloud, "Well, I don't know what is the matter with me, but I must go and fetch the child." When she set off, I was able to guide her without much difficulty, though at that moment I was holding Cyril with the strength of my will, lest the poor child's angel should suddenly vanish before her eyes. You see, when you materialize a form, you are changing matter from its natural state to another, temporarily opposing the cosmic will, so to speak, and if you take your mind off it for half a second, it flies back to its original condition like a flash of lightning. So I couldn't give more than half my attention to that woman, but still I carried her somehow, and as soon as she rounded the corner of the cliff, I let Cyril disappear. But she had seen him, and now that town has one of the best attested stories of angelic intervention on record. The accident happened early in the morning, and that same afternoon I visited, astrally, the family, to see how things were going. The poor boy's leg and arm had been mended, and the large cut bandaged, and he lay in bed very pale and weak, but was evidently going to recover in time. The mother had sent for a couple of neighbors and was telling them the story, and it was a curious story for one who knew the real facts. She explained in so many words that she could not tell what it was, but that something came over her in a minute, making her feel that something had happened to the child, and that she must go out and get him. How at first she thought it was silly and tried to get rid of the feeling. But it was no use, she just had to go. She told how she did not know what had led her to go round that cliff more than anywhere else, but she did, and how as she turned the corner, she saw him leaning against a rock and kneeling beside her the most beautiful boy she had ever seen, dressed in white and glittering, with rosy cheeks and lovely brown eyes. And how he smiled at her, so heavenly. And then in a moment he was not there, and at first she was so frightened she did not know what to think, and then suddenly she felt what he was, and fell on her knees, and thanked God for sending one of his angels to help her poor child. Then she told how, when she lifted him up to carry him home, she wanted to take off the handkerchief that was cutting his leg, but he would not let her, because the angel had tied it and told her not to touch it. And when she told the doctor about it, the doctor explained that if she had untied it, the child would have died. Then he repeated the part of the story the child had told him, how at the moment he fell, a lovely little angel had come to him. He knew it was an angel, because he knew there was no one in sight for half a mile around when he was at the top of the cliff just before. Only he couldn't understand why he had no wings, how she lifted him against the rock and tied his leg, and then began to talk to him and tell him he needn't be frightened, because someone had gone to fetch Mother, and she would be along presently. How she kissed him and tried to make him comfortable, and how her soft, warm little hand held him all the time, while she told him strange, beautiful stories that he could not remember clearly, but he knew were very good, for he had almost forgotten that he was hurt until he saw his mother coming. And how then she assured him that he would soon be all right again, and smiled and squeezed his hand and then somehow disappeared. Since then, there has been a great religious revival in that village. Their minister has told them that such a signal interposition of divine providence must have been a sign to them, to rebuke the scoffers and demonstrate the truth of the Holy Scriptures and the Christian religion, and no one seems to see the colossal presumption involved in such an astounding proposition. But the effect upon the boy had undoubtedly been good, both morally and physically. By all accounts, he was formerly a rather careless young man, but now he feels that his angel may be near him at any time, and he will never do or say anything harsh or rude or angry, lest he should see or hear it. The one great wish of his life is to be able to see him again someday, and he knows that, when he dies, his beautiful face will be the first to greet him on the other side. A beautiful and pathetic little story. The moral which the people and their minister draw from what happened is perhaps a non sequitur, yet the testimony to the existence of at least something beyond this material plane must surely do the people more good than harm. And after all, the mother's conclusion from what she saw was perfectly correct, although a more accurate knowledge would probably have led her to express it a little differently. An interesting fact subsequently discovered by the investigations of the author of the letter throws a curious sidelight on the underlying reasons for such incidents. It was discovered that the two boys had met before, and that some thousands of years ago, the one who fell over the cliff had been the slave of the other, and had once saved his young master's life at the risk of his own, and had been set free in consequence. And now, long afterward, the master not only pays the debt in kind, but also gives his former slave a high ideal and an incentive to the morality of life, which is likely to change the whole course of his future evolution. So true is it that no good deed ever goes unrewarded by karma, however tardy it may seem in its action, that though God's mills grind slowly, yet they grind very little. Though with patience he waits, with exactness he grinds all. Chapter 8. The Story of a Fire. Another work done by the same boy Cyril provides an almost exact parallel to some of the stories in the books I have given in previous pages. He and his older friend, it seems, were one night going about their usual work, when they noticed the fierce glow of a great fire below them, and quickly dived down to see if they could be of any use. It was a large hotel that was on fire, a huge caravanserai on the shores of a large lake. The house, many stories high, formed three sides of a square around a sort of garden, planted with trees and flowers, while the lake formed the fourth side. The two wings faced directly onto the lake, and the large windows that topped them almost projected over the water, so that only a narrow passageway remained on either side. The facade and wings were built around inner shafts, which also contained the latticed elevator shafts, so that when the fire broke out, it spread with almost incredible rapidity, and before our friends saw it in their astral travel, all the intermediate floors of each of the three large blocks were in flames. Fortunately, the inmates, except for one little boy, had already been rescued, although some of them had suffered very serious burns and other injuries. This little boy had been forgotten in one of the upper rooms of the left wing, as his parents had gone out to a dance and knew nothing of the fire, while naturally no one else thought of him until it was too late. The fire had so spread through the intermediate floors of that wing that nothing could have been done, even if anyone had remembered him, for his room overlooked the inner garden already mentioned, so that he was completely cut off from all outside help. Moreover, he was not even aware of the danger he was in, for the dense, suffocating smoke had so gradually filled the room that his sleep had grown deeper and deeper, until he was almost stupefied. In this state he was discovered by Cyril, who seems to be especially attracted to children in need or danger. He first tried in vain to get some of those present to remember the child, and in any case, it seemed unlikely that they would be able to help him, so it soon became evident that this was nothing but a waste of time. The senior aide then materialized, Cyril as before in the room, and set him to work to rouse and awaken the more than half stupefied child. After much difficulty, this was accomplished to some extent, but the boy remained in a half-stunned and semi-conscious state during all that followed, so that he had to be pushed and pulled, guided and assisted throughout. The two boys first crawled out of the room into the central passageway that ran through the wing, and then, finding that the smoke and flames that were beginning to break through the floor made it impassable to a physical body, Cyril managed to get the other boy back into the room and out of the window onto a stone ledge, about a foot wide, that ran right along the block just below the windows. Along this he managed to guide his companion half balancing on the extreme edge of the ledge and half hovering in the air, but always placing himself outside the other to prevent him from getting dizzy and feeling afraid of a fall. Towards the end of the block nearest the lake, in whose direction the fire seemed less developed, they climbed through an open window and reached the passage again, hoping to find the stairway at that end still passable. But it too was full of flames and smoke, so they crawled back down the passage, Cyril advising his companion to keep his mouth close to the floor, until they reached the barred cage of the elevator down the long shaft in the center of the block. The elevator, of course, was at the bottom, but they managed to climb through the latticework inside the cage until they reached the roof of the elevator itself. Here they found themselves blocked, but luckily Cyril discovered a door opening from the elevator cage to a sort of mezzanine just above the first floor. Through it, they came to a passageway which they crossed, with the boy half choked with smoke. Then they made their way through one of the rooms opposite, and finally, climbing through the window, they found themselves at the top of the veranda which ran in front of the first floor, between it and the garden. There it was easy enough to sag down one of the pillars and reach the garden, but even there the heat was intense, and the danger, if the walls fell, very considerable. So Cyril tried to lead his men by the end of one of the wings first, and then by that of the other. But in both cases the flames had burst, and the narrow passages were impassable. Finally they took refuge in one of the pleasure boats, which were moored to the dock steps beside the lakeside garden, and casting off, rowed out into the water. Cyril intended to round the burning wing and land the boy he had saved, but as they got a little way out, they met a steamer passing up the lake and were seen, for the whole scene was illuminated by the glare of the burning hotel, until all was as clear as daylight. The steamer approached the boat to take them out, but instead of the two boys they had seen, the crew found only one, for their older friend had allowed Cyril to return to his astral form, dissipating the denser matter that had made him a material body, so that he was now invisible. A careful search was made, of course, but no trace of the second boy could be found, so it was concluded that he must have fallen overboard and drowned just as they reached the side. The boy who had been rescued fell into a swoon as soon as he was safely on board, so they were unable to get any information out of him, and when he recovered, all he could say was that he had seen the other boy the moment before they came alongside, and after that he knew nothing more. The steamer steamed down the lake to a distant place about 2 days' sail, and a week or so passed before the rescued boy could be returned to his parents, who of course thought he had perished in the flames, for although an effort was made to impress upon their minds the fact that their son had been saved, it proved impossible to convey the idea to them, so you can imagine how great was the joy of the meeting. The boy is still well and happy, and never tires of telling of his wonderful adventure. He has often regretted that the kind friend who saved him should have perished so mysteriously at the very moment when all danger seemed to have passed at last. He has even dared to suggest that perhaps he did not perish after all, that perhaps he was a fairy prince, but of course this idea only elicits tolerant smiles of superiority from his elders. The karmic link between him and his preserver has not yet been traced, but surely there must be one somewhere. Chapter 9. Materialization and Repercussion. When encountering such a story as this, students often wonder whether the invisible helper is perfectly safe in the midst of scenes of mortal danger, whether, for example, this boy who was materialized to save another from a burning house was not himself in some danger, whether his physical body would not have suffered in some way from repercussion if his materialized form had gone through the flames or fallen from the high ledge over whose edge he was walking so carelessly. Indeed, since we know that in many cases the connection between a materialized form and a physical body is close enough to produce repercussion, might it not have occurred in this case? Now this subject of repercussion is extremely abstruse and difficult, and we are by no means yet in a position to explain fully its remarkable phenomena. To understand the matter perfectly, it would probably be necessary to understand the laws of sympathetic vibration on more than one plane. However, we know from observation some of the conditions which permit its action, and some which definitely exclude it, and I think we are authorized to say that it was absolutely impossible here. To see why this is so, we must first remember that there are at least 3 well-defined varieties of materialization, as anyone who has long experience of spiritualism will know. I am not interested for the moment in going into explanations as to how these three varieties respectively occur, but merely state the undoubted fact of their existence. There is the materialization which, though tangible, is not visible to ordinary physical sight. Of this nature are the invisible hands which so often grasp our arm or caress our face in a sitting, which sometimes carry physical objects through the air or tap on the table, although, of course, these last two phenomena can easily occur without a materialized hand. There is the materialization which, though visible, is not tangible, the spirit form through which the hand passes as through empty air. In some cases, this variety is evidently misty and impalpable, but in others its appearance is so completely normal that one never doubts its solidity until someone makes an effort to grasp it. There is the perfect materialization that is both visible and tangible, that not only has the outward appearance of your departed friend, but cordially shakes your hand with the same handshake you know so well. Now, while there is much evidence to show that repercussion takes place under certain conditions, in the case of this third kind of materialization, it is by no means certain that it can occur with either the first or the second kind. In the case of the child helper, it is probable that the materialization is not of the third kind, since the greatest care is always taken not to expend more force than is absolutely necessary to produce whatever result is required, and it is obvious that less energy would be expended in the production of the more partial forms, which we have called the first and second kinds. It is most probable that only the arm with which the boy held his little companion was solid to the touch, and that the rest of his body, though perfectly natural in appearance, would have proved much less palpable if it had been put to the test. But, apart from this probability, there is another point to consider. When complete materialization takes place, whether the subject is alive or dead, physical matter of some kind must be gathered for it. In a spiritist séance, this matter is obtained by having recourse largely to the medium's etheric double, and sometimes also to his physical body, since cases are known in which his weight has considerably diminished while manifestations of this character were taking place. This method is employed by the directing entities of the séance, simply because when an available medium is within reach, it is the easiest way in which a materialization can be accomplished, and the consequence is that the closest connection is thus established between that medium and the materialized body, so that the phenomenon which, though we very imperfectly understand it, we call repercussion, is produced in its clearest form. If, for instance, the hands of the materialized body are rubbed with chalk, that chalk will afterwards be found on the hands of the medium, even though he may have been all the time carefully locked up in a cabinet under circumstances which absolutely exclude all suspicion of fraud. If the materialized form suffers any injury, it will be exactly reproduced in the corresponding part of the medium's body, and sometimes the food of which the spirit form has partaken passes into the medium's body. In the case we have described, however, it would be quite different. Cyril was thousands of miles from his sleeping physical body, and it would therefore be quite impossible for his friend to draw etheric matter from it, while the regulations under which all the disciples of the great masters of wisdom carry on their work of aid to man would surely prevent him, even for the noblest purpose, from putting such a strain upon the body of any other person. Moreover, it would be wholly unnecessary, for the far less dangerous method invariably employed by helpers when materialization seems desirable would be within their reach. The condensation from the surrounding ether, or even from the physical air, of such quantity of matter as might be necessary. This feat, though undoubtedly beyond the power of the average entity manifesting in a séance, presents no difficulty to a student of occult chemistry, but note the difference in the result obtained. In the case of the medium, we have a materialized form in the closest possible connection with the physical body, made of its own substance, and therefore capable of producing all the phenomena of repercussion. In the case of the helper, we have in effect an exact reproduction of the physical body, but created by mental effort out of matter entirely foreign to that body, and no more capable of acting upon it by repercussion than would be an ordinary marble statue of man. Thus, a passage through flames or a fall from the top of a window would have held no terror for the boy helper, and on another occasion, a member of the band, though materialized, was able, without any inconvenience to the physical body, to descend into a sinking ship. In both incidents of his work described above, it will have been noticed that the boy, Cyril, was unable to materialize himself, and the operation had to be performed for him by an older friend. Another of his experiences is worth relating, for it gives us a case in which, thanks to the intensity of pity and the determination of his will, he was able to manifest himself, a case somewhat parallel to that related above of the mother, whose love enabled her in some way to manifest herself in order to save the lives of her children. Inexplicable as it may seem, there is no doubt whatever of the existence in nature of this stupendous power of will over matter on all planes, so that if only the power is great enough, practically any result can be produced by its direct action, without any knowledge or even thought on the part of the man exercising that will as to how it should do its work. We have had many proofs that this power is valid in the case of materialization, though ordinarily it is an art to be learned like any other. Certainly, an average man on the astral plane could not materialize without having previously learned to do so, just as the average man on this plane could not play the violin without having previously learned it. But there are exceptional cases, as will be seen in the following narrative. Chapter 10. The Two Brothers. This story has been told by a pen of far greater dramatic ability than mine, and with a wealth of detail for which I have not space here, in the Theosophical Review for November 1897, page 229. To that account I refer. To that account I refer the reader, as my own description of the case will be a mere sketch, as brief as is compatible with clearness. The names given are, of course, fictitious, but the incidents are related with scrupulous accuracy. Our dramatic characters are two brothers, sons of a country gentleman, Lancelot, aged 14, and Walter, aged 11. Very good boys of the ordinary, healthy, manly type, like hundreds of others in this fair kingdom, with no obvious psychic qualifications of any kind, except the possession of a good deal of Celtic blood. Perhaps the most remarkable characteristic of them was the intensity of affection that existed between them, for they were simply inseparable. Neither would go anywhere without the other, and the younger idolized the elder as only a younger child can. One unfortunate day, Lancelot was thrown from his pony and died, and for Walter, the world was empty. The boy's grief was so real and terrible that he could neither eat nor sleep, and his mother and nurse did not know what to do for him. He seemed deaf to both persuasion and reproach. When they told him that grief was bad, and that his brother was in heaven, he merely replied that he could not be sure of it, and that even if it were true, he knew that Lancelot could be no happier in heaven without him than on earth without Lancelot. Incredible as it might seem, the poor child was dying of grief, and what made the case all the more pathetic was the fact that, unbeknown to him, his brother was at his side all the time, fully aware of his misery, and himself half distracted by the failure of his repeated attempts to touch or speak to him. The situation was still as pitiful on the third night after the accident, when Cyril noticed the two brothers. He doesn't know how. "I was passing by," he says, "but surely the will of the Lords of Compassion guided him there." Poor Walter lay exhausted and sleepless, alone in his desolation, as far as he knew, though all the while his afflicted brother was at his side. Lancelot, free from the chains of the flesh, could see and hear Cyril, so obviously the first thing to do was to soothe his grief with a promise of friendship and help in communicating with his brother. As soon as the dead boy's mind was thus animated by hope, Cyril turned to the living one and tried with all his might to impress upon his brain the knowledge that his brother was beside him, not dead, but alive and loving him as of old. But all his efforts were vain. The apathy of grief so filled poor Walter's mind that no outward suggestion could penetrate, and Cyril knew not what to do. Yet so deeply was he moved by the sad sight, so intense was his sympathy, and so firm was his determination to help in some way or other, at whatever cost of strength to himself, that somehow, even now he cannot tell how, he found himself able to touch and speak to the heartbroken child. Brushing aside Walter's questions about who he was and how he had gotten there, he went straight to the point, telling him that his brother was by his side, striving to make him hear his repeated assurances that he was not dead, but alive, and longing to help and comfort him. Little Walter longed to believe but hardly dared to hope, But Cyril's insistence at last conquered his doubts, and he said, "Oh, I believe you, for you are very kind. But if I could see him, then I should know, then I should be quite sure. And if I could hear his voice telling me he was happy, I should care nothing if he went away again afterwards." In spite of his youth, Cyril knew enough to realize that Walter's wish was not usually granted, and he was beginning to tell him regretfully when he suddenly felt a presence that all helpers know, and though he uttered no word, it got into his head that, instead of what he had meant to say, he was going to promise Walter the blessing his heart desired. "Wait till he comes back," she said, "and then you'll see him." And then he disappeared. That touch of the master's had shown him what to do and how to do it, and he ran to find the older friend who had so often helped him. This old man had not yet retired to sleep, but hearing Cyril's hurried call, he lost no time in accompanying him, and in a few minutes they were again at Walter's bedside. The poor child was beginning to believe it was all a beautiful dream, and his joy and relief when Cyril reappeared were beautiful to see. How much more beautiful, however, was the scene a moment later when, in obedience to a word from the master, the old man materialized the eager Lancelot, and the living and the dead were again hand in hand. Now, indeed, for both brothers, grief had been transformed into joy unspeakable, and again they declared that now they would never again feel sad, for they knew that death had no power to separate them. Even their joy was not quenched when Cyril carefully explained to them, at the suggestion of his elder friend, that this strange physical reunion would not be repeated, but that all day long Lancelot would be near Walter, though Walter could not see him, and every night Walter would emerge from his body and be consciously with his brother once more. Hearing this, poor tired Walter fell asleep at once and ascertained its truth, and was astonished to discover with what hitherto unknown rapidity he and his brother could fly together from one to another of their old familiar places. Cyril thoughtfully warned him that he would probably forget most of his free life when he awoke the next day, but by rare good fortune he did not forget, as happens to so many of us. Perhaps the shock of the great joy had somehow awakened the latent psychic faculty that belongs to Celtic blood. At any rate, he did not forget a single detail of all that had happened, and the next morning he burst into the house of mourning with a wonderful story that did not sit well with him at all. His parents thought that grief had deranged his brain, and since he is now the heir, they have been watching long and anxiously for any further symptoms of insanity, which fortunately they have not found. They still think him a monomaniac at this point, although they fully acknowledge that his delirium has saved his life. But his old nurse, who is a Catholic, is firm in her belief that all she says is true, that the Lord Jesus, who was once a child, took pity on that other child as he lay dying in pain, and sent one of his angels to bring his brother back from the dead as a reward for a love that was stronger than death. Sometimes popular superstition gets much closer to the heart of things than educated skepticism. The story does not end here, for the good work begun that night continues to progress, and no one can tell how far the influence of that act may ramify. Walter's astral consciousness, once fully awakened, remains in activity. Every morning brings to his physical brain the memory of his nightly adventures with his brother. Every evening they meet with their dear friend Cyril, from whom they have learned so much about the wonderful new world that has opened before them, and of the other worlds to come that lie still higher. Under Cyril's guidance they too, both the living and the dead, have become enthusiastic and earnest members of the band of helpers, and probably for years to come, until Lancelot's vigorous young astral body disintegrates. Many a dying child will have reason to be grateful to these three, who are trying to pass on to others some of the joy they themselves have received. Nor is it only the dead whom these new converts have served, for they have sought out and found some other living children who show consciousness on the astral plane during sleep, and at least one of those who have thus brought Cyril has already proved to be a valuable recruit to the children's band, as well as a very kindly little friend down here on the physical plane. Those to whom all these ideas are new sometimes find it very difficult to understand how children can be useful in the astral world. Seeing, they say, that the astral body of a child is undeveloped, and that the ego is limited by childhood, both on the astral and physical planes, in what way could such an ego be useful or able to help the spiritual, mental and moral evolution of humanity, which we are told is the chief concern of the helpers? When this question was first asked, shortly after the publication of one of these stories in our magazine, I sent it to c.w.l himself to see what he would answer. It is quite true, as the writer says, that I am only a boy and know very little as yet, and that I shall be much more useful when I have learned more. But I can do a little even now, for there are many people who have not yet learned anything about theosophy, though they know much more than I do about everything else. And you see that when you want to get to a certain place, one little child who knows the way can do more for you than 100 wise men who do not know the way. It may be added that when a child has been awakened on the astral plane, the development of the astral body would proceed so rapidly that he would very soon find himself in a position on that plane very little inferior to that of the awakened adult. And of course he would be far ahead, so far as usefulness is concerned, of the wisest man who had not yet awakened. But unless the ego expressing itself through the child body possesses the necessary qualification of a resolute and at the same time loving disposition, and has clearly manifested it in its previous lives, no occultist would assume the very grave responsibility of awakening it on the astral plane. However, when their karma is such that it is possible for them to be awakened in this way, children often prove to be the most efficient helpers, and throw themselves into their work with a whole-souled devotion that is very beautiful to see. And so the ancient prophecy, "A little child shall lead them," is once more fulfilled. Another question that arises in reading this last story of the two brothers is the following. Since c.w.l was somehow able to materialize by sheer force of love and pity and willpower, is it not strange that Lancelot, who had been trying much longer to communicate, did not manage to do the same? Well, of course, there is no difficulty in seeing why poor Lancelot was unable to communicate with his brother, for that inability is simply the normal condition of things. The wonder is that c.w.l was able to materialize, not that Lancelot was not. Not only, however, was the feeling probably stronger in c.w.l's case, but he also knew exactly what he wanted to do. He knew that such a thing as materialization was a possibility, and had some general idea of how it was done, while Lancelot, naturally, knew nothing of all this then, though he does now. Chapter 11. Shipwrecks and Catastrophes. Sometimes it is possible for members of the band of helpers to avert impending catastrophes of a somewhat greater order. In more than one instance, when the captain of a vessel has been carried, unsuspectingly, far off his course by some unknown current or miscalculation, and has thus run into grave danger, it has been possible to avert shipwreck by repeatedly impressing upon his mind the feeling that something was wrong. And though this generally reaches the captain's brain merely as a vague intuition of warning, yet, if it occurs again and again, he is almost certain to pay some attention to it and take such precautions as are suggested to him. In one case, for instance, where the captain of a boat was much nearer land than he supposed, he was urged again and again to lower the bow, and though for some time he resisted this suggestion as unnecessary and absurd, he at last gave the order somewhat hesitatingly. The result astonished him, and he at once tacked his ship and steered away from the coast, though it was not until morning came that he realized how near he had come to a frightful disaster. Often, however, a catastrophe is of a karmic nature, and consequently cannot be averted, but it should not therefore be assumed that in such cases no help can be rendered. It may be that the persons affected are destined to die and therefore cannot be saved from death, but in many cases they may be prepared to some extent for it, and can certainly be helped to reach the other side after it has passed. Indeed, it is safe to say that wherever there is a great catastrophe of any kind, there is also a special dispatch of help. Two recent instances in which such aid was rendered were the sinking of Drummond Castle off Cape Ushant and the terrible cyclone which devastated the city of St. Louis in America. On both occasions, a few minutes' notice was given, and the helpers did their best to calm and elevate the minds of the men, so that when the shock came upon them, it would be less disturbing than it might otherwise have been. Naturally, however, most of the work done with the victims of these two calamities was done on the astral plane, after they had left their physical bodies. But of this we shall speak later. It is sad to relate how often, when a catastrophe is imminent, helpers are impeded in their kindly offices by wild panic among those whom the danger threatens, or sometimes, worse still, by a mad rush of drunkenness among those whom they are trying to help. Many a ship has gone to its doom with almost all the souls on board, driven mad by drink, and thus totally unable to benefit from any help offered before death, or for a long time afterwards. If it should ever happen to any of us to find ourselves in a situation of imminent danger, which we can do nothing to avoid, we should try to remember that help is certainly near us, and that it is entirely up to ourselves to make the helper's work easier or more difficult. If we face the danger calmly and courageously, recognizing that the true ego can in no way be affected by it, our minds will then be open to receive the guidance which the helpers are trying to give. And this cannot but be the best thing for us, whether its object be to save us from death, or, when this is impossible, to lead us safely through it. This latter kind of help has not infrequently been rendered in cases of individual accidents, as well as in more general catastrophes. It will suffice to mention one example to illustrate what is meant. In one of the great storms that did so much damage on our coasts a few years ago, it happened that a fishing boat capsized offshore. The only persons on board were an old fisherman and a boy, and the former managed to cling for a few minutes to the capsized boat. There was no physical help at hand, and even if there had been in such a raging storm, it would have been impossible to do anything. So the fisherman knew very well that there was no hope of escape, and that death could only be a matter of moments. He felt great terror at the prospect, especially impressed by the terrible loneliness of that vast sea, and he was also very anxious about his wife and family, and the difficulties in which they would be placed by his sudden death. An attendant passing by, seeing all this, tried to console him, but finding his mind too much disturbed to be impressionable, thought it advisable to show herself to him the better to help him. In telling the story later, she said that the change that came over the fisherman's face at the sight of her was wonderful and beautiful to see. With the bright form standing on the boat above him, he could not think that an angel had been sent to comfort him in his trouble, and therefore he felt that not only would he himself be brought safely through the gates of death, but that his family would surely be cared for also. Thus, when death came upon him a few moments later, he was in a very different frame of mind from the terror and perplexity which had come over him before. And naturally, when he regained consciousness on the astral plane and found the angel still at his side, he felt at home with her and was ready to accept her advice as to the new life into which he had entered. Some time later, the same helper was involved in another job of a very similar character, the story of which she has since told as follows. You remember that steamer that was wrecked in the cyclone at the end of November last? I went to the cabin, where they had locked up a dozen women, and found them wailing in the most pitiful manner, sobbing and moaning with fear. The ship had to go down, no help was possible, and to leave the world in this state of frantic terror is the worst possible way to enter the next. So to calm them, I materialized, and of course they thought I was an angel, poor souls. They all fell on their knees and begged me to save them, and one poor mother pushed her baby into my arms, imploring me to at least save it. Soon they became calm and composed as we talked, and the baby fell asleep smiling, and before long they were all peacefully asleep, and I filled their minds with thoughts of the heavenly world, so that they did not wake when the ship made her final plunge. I went down with them to make sure they slept until the last moment, and they never stirred when their sleep turned to death. Evidently here again those who were helped in this way had not only the enormous advantage of being able to face death calmly and reasonably, but also the still greater advantage of being met on the other shore by someone whom they were already willing to love and trust, someone who understood perfectly the new world in which they found themselves, and who could not only reassure them as to their safety, but also advise them how to order their lives in these altered circumstances. And this brings us to the consideration of one of the greatest and most important departments of the work of the invisible helpers, the guidance and assistance which they are able to give to the dead. Chapter 12. The Work Among the Dead. One of the many evils resulting from the absurdly erroneous teaching about conditions after death, which is unfortunately current in our Western world, is that those who have recently shaken off this mortal sheath are generally very bewildered and often very frightened, to find everything so different from what their religion had led them to expect. The mental attitude of a large number of such people was keenly expressed the other day by an English general, who 3 days after his death met one of the group of helpers he had known in physical life. After expressing his great relief at having at last found someone with whom he could communicate, his first remark was, "But if I am dead, where am I? For if this is heaven, it does not seem much to me, and if it is hell, it is better than I expected." But unfortunately, a much larger number take things less philosophically. They have been taught that all men are destined for eternal flames, except a favored few who are superhumanly good, and as a little self-examination convinces them that they do not belong to that category, they too often find themselves in a condition of panic terror, fearing every moment that the new world in which they find themselves may dissolve and drop them into the clutches of the devil, in whom they have been seductively taught to believe. In many cases, long periods of acute mental suffering pass before they can free themselves from the fatal influence of this blasphemous doctrine of eternal punishment, before they can realize that the world is governed, not according to the whim of a horrible devil who gloats over human distress, but according to a benevolent and wonderfully patient law of evolution, which is absolutely just, but which again and again offers man opportunities for progress, if he will take advantage of them at every stage of his career. It is only fair to mention that this terrible evil assumes its most aggravated form only among the so-called Protestant communities. The great Roman Catholic Church, with its doctrine of purgatory, comes much nearer to a conception of the astral plane, and its devout members, if anything, realize that the state in which they find themselves soon after death is merely temporary, and that it is their business to strive to get out of it as soon as possible by intense spiritual aspiration, while accepting whatever suffering may befall them as necessary to wear away the imperfections of their character before they can pass on to higher and brighter regions. It will be seen then that there is much work to be done for the helpers among the newly dead, for in the great majority of cases they need to be soothed and reassured, to be comforted and instructed. In the astral world, as in the physical, there are many who are unwilling to accept advice from those who know more than they do. Yet the very strangeness of the conditions surrounding them makes many of the dead willing to accept the guidance of those to whom these conditions are obviously familiar. And the stay of many a man on that plane has been considerably shortened by the earnest efforts of this group of energetic workers. It is not, let it be well understood, to interfere in any way with the karma of the dead man. He has built up during life an astral body of some degree of density, and until that body is sufficiently dissolved, he cannot pass into the heavenly world beyond. But he need not lengthen the period necessary for that process by adopting an improper attitude. All students should clearly understand the truth that the duration of a man's astral life, after he has left his physical body, depends mainly on two factors: the nature of his past physical life and his mental attitude after what we call death. During his earthly life, he constantly influences the formation of matter in his astral body. He affects it directly by the passions, emotions, and desires which he allows himself to be dominated. He affects it indirectly by the action upon it of his thoughts from above, and of the details of his physical life, his continence or his debauchery, his cleanliness or his filth, his eating and drinking, from below. If by persisting in perversity on any of these lines, he is so stupid as to build himself a coarse and crude astral vehicle, habituated to respond only to the lower vibrations of the plane, he will find himself after death bound to that plane during the long, slow process of disintegration of that body. On the other hand, if by a decent and careful life he endows himself with a vehicle composed mainly of finer material, he will have far less post-mortem trouble and discomfort, and his evolution will proceed much more rapidly and easily. This is what is generally understood, but the second great factor, his mental attitude after death, often seems to be forgotten. What is desirable is that he should realize his position in this particular little arc of his evolution, that he should learn that at this stage he is constantly withdrawing inward toward the plane of the true ego, and that it is therefore his duty to detach his thoughts, as far as possible, from physical things, and to fix his attention more and more upon the spiritual matters which will occupy him during his life in the heavenly world. By doing this, he will greatly facilitate natural astral disintegration and avoid the sadly common error of delaying unnecessarily in the lower levels of what should be such a temporary residence. But many of the dead delay the process of dissolution considerably, clinging passionately to the earth they have left. They simply do not direct their thoughts and desires upward, but spend their time in struggling with all their might to remain in full contact with the physical plane, thus causing great trouble to anyone who tries to help them. Earthly affairs are the only ones in which they have ever had any living interest, and they cling to them with desperate tenacity, even after death. Naturally, as time goes on, they find it increasingly difficult to cling to things here below, but instead of welcoming and encouraging this process of gradual refinement and spiritualization, they resist it vigorously by every means in their power. Of course, the mighty force of evolution is finally too strong for them, and they are swept along by its beneficent current, yet they struggle every step of the way, thereby not only causing themselves a great deal of wholly unnecessary pain and sorrow, but also very seriously retarding their upward progress and prolonging their stay in the astral regions to an almost indefinite point. In convincing them that this ignorant and disastrous opposition to the cosmic will is contrary to the laws of nature, and persuading them to adopt a mental attitude which is exactly the reverse of it, consists much of the work of those who try to help. It sometimes happens that the departed are bound to the earth by anxiety, sometimes by unfulfilled duties or unpaid debts, but more often by not having a wife or children to care for. In such cases, it has been necessary more than once, before the deceased was satisfied to continue his ascending path in peace, for the helper to act to some extent as his representative on the physical plane, and to deal on his behalf with the solution of matters of concern. An illustration taken from our recent experience will perhaps make this clearer. One of our disciples was trying to help a poor man who had died in one of our western cities, but it was impossible for him to take his mind off earthly things because of his anxiety for two small children whom his death had left without means of support. His wife had been dead about 2 years, and his landlady, though very kind-hearted and willing to do all in her power for them, was too poor to be able to adopt them, and very reluctantly came to the conclusion that she would be obliged to hand them over to the parish authorities. This was a great pity to the late father, though he could not blame the landlady, and he himself was unable to suggest any other course. Our friend asked him if he had no relative to whom he could entrust them, but the father knew of none. He had a younger brother, he said, who no doubt would have done something for him in this extreme situation, but it was 15 years since he had lost sight of him, and he did not even know whether he was alive or dead. He had last been heard of as a carpenter's apprentice in the north, and was then described as a steady young man who, if he lived, would certainly come through. The leads that were to be had were certainly very scanty, but as there seemed to be no other prospect of help for the children, our friend thought it worthwhile to make a special effort to follow them up. Taking the dead man with him, he began a patient search for the brother in the town indicated, and after many difficulties they succeeded in finding him. He was a master carpenter with a fairly prosperous business, married but childless, though he earnestly desired them, and therefore apparently the right man for the emergency. The question now was how to convey the information to this brother. Fortunately, he was found to be so impressionable that the circumstances of his brother's death and the destitution of his children could be vividly presented to him in a dream, and this was repeated 3 times, the place and even the name of the landlady being clearly indicated to him. This recurring vision impressed him greatly, and he discussed it seriously with his wife, who advised him to write to the address given. He was not pleased to do so, but felt strongly inclined to travel to the West Country, find out if there was such a house as he had seen, and if so, to seek some excuse to visit it. He was a busy man, however, and finally decided that he could not afford to lose a day's work over what, after all, might well turn out to be no more than the unfounded plot of a dream. The attempt having apparently failed, it was decided to try another method, so one of the assistants wrote a letter to the man detailing the circumstances of his brother's death and the position of the children, exactly as he had seen them in his dream. On receiving this confirmation, he hesitated no longer, and set out the next day for the city indicated, where he was welcomed with open arms by the kindly landlady. The helpers had no difficulty in persuading her to stay with the children for a few days, in the hope that something might happen to them, and she has since congratulated herself on having done so. The carpenter, of course, took the children with him and provided them with a happy home, and the dead father, no longer distressed, passed on rejoicing to his upward journey. As some theosophical writers have felt it their duty to dwell in strong terms upon the evils which so frequently attend the holding of spiritualistic seances, it is only fair to admit that on several occasions good work similar to that of the helper in the case just described has been done through the agency of a medium or of someone present in a circle. Thus, although Spiritism has often detained souls who, but for it, would have been more quickly liberated, it must be credited with having also provided the means of escape for others, thus opening to them the road to progress. There have been cases in which the deceased has been able to present himself unaided to his relatives or friends and to explain his wishes to them, but these are naturally rare, and most souls who are bound to the earth by anxieties of the kind indicated can only be satisfied by the services of the medium or conscious helper. Another very frequent case on the astral plane is that of the man who cannot believe that he is dead. Indeed, most people regard the very fact that they are still conscious as absolute proof that they have not passed through the portals of death. A kind of satire, if you think about it, on the practical value of our much vaunted belief in the immortality of the soul. Whatever label they may have given themselves during their lifetime, the great majority of those who die, in this country at least, prove by their later attitude to have been to all intents and purposes materialists at heart. And those on earth who have honestly called themselves so are often no more difficult to deal with than others who would have been shocked at the mere name. A very recent case was that of a scientific man who, finding himself fully conscious and yet in conditions radically different from any he had experienced before, had persuaded himself that he was still alive and that he was merely the victim of a prolonged and unpleasant sleep. Fortunately for him, among the group of people capable of acting on the astral plane was the son of an old friend of his, a young man whose father had commissioned him to seek out the late scientist and try to render him some assistance. When, after some difficulty, the young man found him and accosted him, he frankly admitted that he was in a state of great bewilderment and discomfort, but still clung desperately to his dream hypothesis as the most probable explanation of what he had seen, and even went so far as to suggest that his visitor was no more than a dream figure. At last, however, he yielded so far as to propose a sort of test, and said to the young man, "If you are, as you assert, a living person, and the son of my old friend, bring me from him some message which will prove to me your objective reality." Now, although under all ordinary conditions on the physical plane, it is strictly forbidden to the pupils of the masters to give any kind of phenomenal proof, it seemed as if a case of this kind hardly came within the rules, and therefore, when it had been ascertained that there was no objection on the part of the higher authorities, a request was made to the father, who immediately sent a message referring to a series of events which had occurred before the birth of the son. This convinced the dead man of the real existence of his young friend, and therefore of the plane on which they both functioned, and as soon as he felt that this was established, his scientific training at once reasserted itself, and he became extremely anxious to acquire as much information as possible about this new region. Of course, the message which he so readily accepted as proof was in reality no proof at all, for the facts to which it referred could have been read from his own mind or from the records of the past by any creature possessed of astral senses. But his ignorance of these possibilities allowed this definite impression to be made upon him, and the theosophical instruction which his young friend is now giving him every night will undoubtedly have a stupendous effect upon his future, for it cannot but greatly modify not only the celestial state immediately before him, but also his next incarnation on earth. The chief work, then, which our helpers do for the newly dead, is to reassure and comfort them, to deliver them, when possible, from the terrible and unreasonable fear which too often takes possession of them, and which not only causes them much unnecessary suffering, but retards their progress to the higher spheres, and to enable them, as far as possible, to understand the future which awaits them. Others who have remained longer on the astral plane can also receive much help, if they accept it, from explanations and advice about their course through the different stages. They may, for example, be warned of the danger and delay caused by attempting to communicate with the living through a medium, and sometimes, though rarely an entity, already drawn into a spiritualistic circle, may be guided to a higher and healthier life. The teaching thus given to people on this plane is by no means lost, for although the memory of it cannot, of course, be transferred directly to the next incarnation, there always remains the true inner knowledge, and thus the strong predisposition to accept it immediately when heard again in the new life. A rather remarkable case of service rendered to the dead was the first achievement of a very recent recruit to the helper group, hardly yet a full member. This young aspirant had shortly before lost an elderly relative for whom he felt a very special affection, and his first request was that a more experienced friend should take him to visit her in the hope that he might be of some use to her. This was done, and the effect of the meeting between the living and the dead was very beautiful and touching. The old woman's astral life was now drawing to a close, but a state of apathy, dullness, and uncertainty prevented her from making immediate progress. But when the boy, who had been so much to her in earthly life, appeared once more before her, and dissolved with the sunlight of his love the grey mist of depression that had gathered around her, she awoke from her stupor, and she soon understood that he had come to explain her situation and tell her of the glories of the higher life toward which her thoughts and aspirations were now to be directed. But when she realized this, there was in her such an awakening of dormant feelings and such a surge of devoted affection for her young helper that the last fetters which bound her to the astral life were broken, and a great outburst of love and gratitude swept her at once into the higher consciousness of the heavenly world. Truly, there is no greater and more beneficent power in the universe than that of pure and unselfish love. Chapter 13. Other branches of the work. But turning now again from the all-important work among the dead to the consideration of the work among the living, we must briefly indicate one great branch of it, without a note of which our account of the labors of our invisible helpers would certainly be incomplete, and that is the immense amount which is done by suggestion, simply by putting good thoughts into the minds of those who are willing to receive them. Let there be no mistake as to what is meant here. It would be perfectly easy to a degree that would be quite incredible to those who do not understand the subject in practice, for a helper to master the mind of any ordinary man and make him think as he pleases, and that without arousing the slightest suspicion of any external influence on the mind of the subject. But, however admirable the result might be, such a proceeding would be wholly inadmissible. All that can be done is to throw the good thought into the person's mind as one among the hundreds that are constantly sweeping through it. If the man takes it up, makes it his own, and acts upon it, it depends entirely upon himself. If it were otherwise, it is obvious that all the good karma of the action would accrue only to the helper, for the subject would have been a mere tool and not an actor, which is not what is desired. The help rendered in this way is of a very varied character. The consolation of those who suffer or grieve is immediately forthcoming, as is the effort to guide to the truth those who earnestly seek it. When a person is anxiously pondering a spiritual or metaphysical problem, it is often possible to put the solution into his mind without his realizing that it comes from an outside agency. A pupil may also often be employed as an agent in what can hardly be described in any other way than as the answer to prayer. For while it is true that any fervent spiritual desire, such as might be supposed to find expression in prayer, is in itself a force which automatically produces certain results, it is also a fact that such spiritual effort offers an opportunity for influence to the powers of good, of which they are not slow to avail themselves, and sometimes it is the privilege of a willing helper to be the channel through which their energy is poured. What is said of prayers is true to an even greater extent of meditation, for those to whom this higher exercise is a possibility. In addition to these more general methods of help, there are also special lines open only to a few. Time and again fit pupils have been employed to suggest true and beautiful thoughts to authors, poets, artists, and musicians. But obviously, not all helpers are capable of being used in this way. Sometimes, though more rarely, it is possible to warn people of the danger to their moral development of some course they are pursuing, to ward off evil influences from around some person or place, or to counteract the machinations of black magicians. It is not often possible to give direct instruction in the great truths of nature to persons outside the circle of occult students, but occasionally it is possible to do something in that direction by placing before the minds of preachers and teachers a wider range of thought or a more liberal view of some question than they would otherwise have taken. Naturally, as a student of occultism progresses on the path, he reaches a wider sphere of usefulness. Instead of helping individuals only, he learns how classes, nations, and races are treated, and is entrusted with a gradually increasing share of the higher and more important work done by the adepts themselves. As he acquires the necessary power and knowledge, he begins to handle the major forces of the mental and astral planes, and is taught how to make the most of every favorable cyclic influence. He is brought into relation with those great nirmanakayas, who are sometimes symbolized as the stones of the guardian wall, and becomes at first, of course, in the humblest capacity one of their almsmen, and learns how those forces which are the fruit of his sublime self-denial are dispersed. Thus he gradually rises higher and higher, until, flourishing finally as an adept, he is able to assume all the responsibility that rests upon the masters of wisdom, and to help others along the path he has trodden. On the mental plane, the work differs somewhat, for the teaching can be given and received in a much more direct, rapid, and perfect manner, while the influences set in motion are infinitely more powerful because they act on a much higher level. But, though it is useless to speak of it in detail at present, since so few of us are able to function consciously on this plane during life, here also, and still higher, there is always much work to be done as soon as we can make ourselves able to do it. And certainly there is no fear that for countless eons we shall find ourselves without a career of unselfish usefulness open before us. Chapter 14. The Qualities Required. How, it may be asked, are we to make ourselves capable of participating in this great work? Well, there is no mystery as to the qualities needed by one who aspires to be a helper. The difficulty is not in knowing what they are, but in developing them in oneself. To a certain extent they have already been described incidentally, but it is convenient to state them fully and categorically. Single-mindedness. The first requisite is that we should have recognized the great work which the Masters want us to do, and that it should be for us the one great interest of our lives. We must learn to distinguish not only between useful and useless work, but between different kinds of useful work, so that each of us may devote himself to the highest of which he is capable, and not waste his time in working at something which, however good it may be for the man who can do no better, is unworthy of the knowledge and ability which should be ours as theosophists. A man who wishes to be considered eligible for employment on higher planes should begin by doing all that is within his power in the way of work defined for theosophy here below. Of course, I do not mean for a moment that we should neglect the ordinary duties of life. Certainly, we should do well not to undertake new worldly duties of any kind, but those which we have already strapped upon our shoulders have become a karmic obligation which we have no right to neglect. Unless we have fully discharged the duties that karma has imposed upon us, we will not be free for higher work. But this higher work must be for us the only thing that is really worth living for, the constant background of a life devoted to the service of the Masters of Compassion, perfect self-control. Before we can be safely entrusted with the wider powers of the astral life, we must have ourselves perfectly controlled. Our temper, for example, must be completely under control, so that nothing we see or hear can cause us real irritation, for the consequences of such irritation would be far more serious on that plane than on this. The force of thought is always an enormous power, but down here it is reduced and deadened by the heavy physical particles of the brain which it has to set in motion. In the astral world, it is much freer and more potent, and for a man with the faculty fully awakened to feel anger against a person, there would be to do him serious and perhaps even fatal harm. We need not only to control the temperament, but also the nerves, so that none of the fantastic or terrible spectacles we may encounter will be able to shake our fearless courage. It should be remembered that the disciple who awakens a man on the astral plane thereby incurs a certain responsibility for his actions and for his safety, so that unless his neophyte had the courage to stand alone, all the older worker's time would be lost in hovering around him to protect him, which it would be manifestly unreasonable to expect. To make sure of this control of nerves and of their suitability for the work to be done, Candidates always have to pass, now as of old, the so-called tests of earth, water, air, and fire. In other words, they have to learn, with the absolute certainty given not by theory, but by practical experience, that in their astral bodies, none of these elements can be detrimental to them, that none of them can stand in the way of the work they have to perform. In this physical body, we are fully convinced that fire will burn us, that water will drown us, that solid rock forms an impassable barrier to our progress, that we cannot safely launch ourselves unsupported into the ambient air. So deeply is this conviction ingrained in us that it costs most men a great effort to overcome the instinctive action which follows from it, and to realize that in the astral body the densest rock offers no impediment to their freedom of movement, that they can leap with impunity from the highest cliff, and plunge with the utmost confidence into the heart of the raging volcano, or into the deepest abysses of the unfathomable ocean. Until a man knows this, however, knows it well enough to act on the basis of his knowledge instinctively and confidently, he is comparatively useless for astral work, for in the emergencies that constantly arise, he would be perpetually paralyzed by imaginary incapacities. He has therefore to go through his trials and through many other strange experiences, to meet face to face with serene courage the most terrifying apparitions in the midst of the most revolting surroundings, to prove in fact that his mettle can be fully relied upon in each and every one of the varied sets of circumstances in which he may find himself at any given moment. Further, we need control of mind and desire. Of mind, because without the power of concentration, it would be impossible to do good work amid all the distracting currents of the astral plane. Of desire, because in that strange world, to desire is very often to have, and unless this part of our nature were well controlled, we might find ourselves face to face with creations of our own, of which we should be heartily ashamed. Calmness. This is another very important point, the absence of all worry and depression. Much of the work consists in calming those who are disturbed and cheering up those who are sad, and how can a helper do that work if his own aura is vibrating with constant fuss and worry, or grey with the deadly melancholy that comes from perpetual depression? Nothing is more hopelessly fatal to progress or hidden usefulness than our 19th century habit of worrying incessantly about trifles, of eternally making mountains out of molehills. Many of us simply spend our lives magnifying the most absurd trivialities, working solemnly and elaborately to make ourselves miserable over nothing. Surely we who are theosophists should, if anything, have passed beyond this stage of irrational worry and causeless depression. Surely we who are trying to acquire some definite knowledge of the cosmic order should by now have realized that the optimistic view of everything is always nearer to the divine view, and therefore to the truth, for only that which in any person is good and beautiful can be permanent, while evil must by its very nature be temporary. Indeed, as Browning said, evil is naught, it is nothing, it is silence implying sound, while above and beyond all this, the soul of things is sweet, the heart of being is heavenly rest. Thus, those who know maintain an imperturbable calm, and with his perfect sympathy combine the joyous serenity that comes from the certainty that in the end all will be well, and those who wish to help must learn to follow his example. Knowledge. To be useful, man must have at least some knowledge of the nature of the plane on which he has to work, and the more knowledge he has in each and every direction, the more useful he will be. He must prepare himself for this task by carefully studying the theosophical literature, for he cannot expect those whose time is already so fully occupied to waste part of it in explaining to him what he could have learned down here by taking the trouble to read the books. No one who is not already as serious a student as his abilities and opportunities permit need begin to think of himself as a candidate for astral work. Disinterest. It hardly seems necessary to insist upon this requirement, for everyone who has studied a modicum of theosophy must know that so long as the slightest taint of selfishness subsists in a man, he is not fit to be entrusted with higher powers, nor to undertake a work whose very essence is that the worker should forget himself and remember the good of others. He who is still capable of selfish thoughts, whose personality is still so strong in him that he can allow himself to be diverted from his work by feelings of petty pride or suggestions of wounded dignity, that man is not yet ready to show the selfless devotion of the helper. Love. This, the last and most important of the qualities, is also the most misunderstood. It is not at all the cheap, brainless sentimentality that always overflows in vague platitudes and gushing generalities, but which is afraid to stand firm in the right, lest it be branded by the ignorant as unbrotherly. What is needed is the love that is strong enough not to boast of itself, but to act without speaking of it, the intense desire for service that is always on the lookout for an opportunity to render it, even if it prefers to do so anonymously, the feeling that wells up in the heart of one who has performed the great work of the Logos, and who once seen knows that for him there can be in the three worlds no other way than to identify himself with it to the limit of his strength, to become, however humble and however great the distance, a minute channel of that wonderful love of God, which, like the peace of God, surpasses the understanding of man. These are the qualities for the possession of which the helper must ceaselessly strive, and of which he must possess at least a considerable measure before he can hope that the great ones who follow him will deem him fit for a full awakening. The ideal is indeed a very high one, yet no one should be discouraged or think that, while striving to attain it, he must necessarily remain useless on the astral plane, for, without coming to the responsibilities and dangers of full awakening, much can be done safely and profitably. There is hardly anyone among us who is not capable of performing at least one definite act of mercy and goodwill each night while we are away from our bodies. Our condition when we sleep is generally one of absorption in thought, let us remember, a continuation of the thoughts that have chiefly occupied us during the day, and especially of the last thought in the mind when we sink into sleep. Now, if we make of that last thought the firm intention to go and render aid to someone whom we know needs it, the soul, when released from the body, will undoubtedly carry out that intention, and the aid will be rendered. There are several cases on record where, when this attempt has been made, the person thought of has been fully aware of the effort of the would-be helper, and has even seen his astral body in the act of carrying out the instructions impressed upon it. Indeed, no one need be saddened by the thought that he can have no part or lot in this glorious work. Such a feeling would be entirely false, for everyone who can think can help. Nor need this helpful action be confined to our sleeping hours. If you know, and who does not, of anyone who is grieving or suffering, though you cannot consciously be in astral form at his bedside, you may, nevertheless, send him loving thoughts and sincere good wishes, and be well assured that such thoughts and wishes are real and living and strong, that when you send them thus, they really go and work your will in proportion to the force you have put into them. Thoughts are things, intensely real things, sufficiently visible to those whose eyes have been opened to see, and by their means the poorest man can fulfill his part in the good work of the world as fully as the richest. Thus, at least, whether we can function consciously on the astral plane or not, we can all join, and all should join, the army of invisible helpers. But the aspirant who definitely desires to become part of the group of astral helpers, working under the direction of the great masters of wisdom, will make his preparation part of a much larger plan of development. Instead of striving merely to train himself for this particular branch of their service, he will undertake with great resolution the far greater task of training himself to follow in their footsteps, of bending all the energies of his soul to attain even what they have attained, so that his power to help the world will not be confined to the astral plane, but will extend to those higher levels which are the true home of man's divine being. For him, the path has long ago been marked out by the wisdom of those who have trodden it in the days of old, a path of self-development, which sooner or later all must follow, whether they choose to adopt it of their own free will, or wait until, after many lives and an infinity of sufferings, the slow, irresistible force of evolution impels them to tread it among the stragglers of the human family. But the wise man is he who undertakes it at once, directing his face resolutely toward the goal of the adept, so that, being himself forever safe from all doubt, fear, and sorrow, he may help others also to attain safety and happiness. What are the steps of this path of holiness, as the Buddhists call it, and in what order they are arranged, we shall see in our next chapter. Chapter 15. The probationary path. The Eastern books tell us that there are 4 means by which a man may be brought to the beginning of the path of spiritual advancement: by the company of those who have already entered it, by hearing or reading definite teachings on occult philosophy, by enlightened reflection, i.e., that by the force of hard thought and thorough reasoning he may arrive at the truth, or a part of it, for himself, by the practice of virtue, which means that a long series of virtuous lives, though not necessarily involving any increase of intellectuality, finally develops in man sufficient intuition to enable him to understand the necessity of entering upon the path, and shows him in what direction he stands. When by one or other of these means he has reached this point, the way to the higher adept lies directly before him, if he chooses to take it. In writing for students of occultism, it is hardly necessary to say that in our present state of development, we cannot hope to learn all, or nearly all, about the lower rungs of this path. While of the higher ones we know little more than the names, though we may occasionally glimpse the indescribable glory that surrounds them. According to esoteric teachings, these stages are grouped into 3 great divisions. First, the probationary period, before definite commitments are made, or initiations, in the full sense of the word, are given. This brings a man to the level necessary to pass successfully through what in theosophical books is usually called the critical period of the 5th round. Second, the period of the promised discipleship, or the path proper, the 4 stages of which are often referred to in Eastern books as the 4 paths to holiness. At the end of this period, the disciple attains adepthood, the level that humanity must reach at the end of the 7th round. Third, what we may venture to call the official period, in which the adept takes a definite part, under the great cosmic law, in the government of the world, and occupies a special office connected therewith. Of course, every adept, even every disciple, once definitely accepted, as we have seen in the preceding chapters, takes part in the great work of aiding the evolution of man. But those on the higher levels take charge of special departments, and correspond in the cosmic scheme to ministers of the crown in a well-ordered earth state. We do not propose to deal in this book with this official period. No information has ever been made public about it, and the whole subject is too far beyond our comprehension to be dealt with profitably in print. We shall therefore confine ourselves to the first 2 divisions. Before going into the details of the probationary period, it is well to mention that in most Eastern sacred books, this stage is regarded as merely preliminary, and hardly as part of the path, for they regard it as only really beginning when definite promises have been made. Considerable confusion has been created by the fact that the numbering of the stages sometimes begins at this point, though more often at the beginning of the 2nd great division. Sometimes the stages themselves are counted, and sometimes the initiations leading up to them or coming out of them, so that in studying the books one has to be perpetually on guard to avoid misunderstandings. This probationary period, however, differs considerably in character from the others. The divisions between its stages are less decidedly marked than those of the higher groups, and the requirements are not so definite or so exacting. But it will be easier to explain this last point after giving a list of the 5 stages of this period, with their respective qualifications. The first 4 were very ably described by Mr. Mohini Mohun Chatterjee in the first London Lodge transaction, to which readers may be referred for fuller definitions than can be given here. Much extremely valuable information about them is also given by Madame Besant in her books The Path of Discipleship and In the Outer Court. The names given to the stages will differ somewhat, because in those books the Hindu Sanskrit terminology was employed, while the Pali nomenclature used here is that of the Buddhist system. But although the subject is thus approached from a different side, so to speak, it will be found that the qualifications required are exactly the same in effect, even when the external form varies. In the case of each word, the mere meaning given by the dictionary will be given first in brackets, followed by the explanation usually given by the teacher. The first stage, then, is called among the Buddhists Manodvara Vajjana, the opening of the doors of the mind, or perhaps the flight through the door of the mind. In this stage, the candidate acquires a firm intellectual conviction of the impermanence and futility of mere earthly pursuits. It is often described as learning the difference between the real and the unreal. Learning it usually takes a long time and many hard lessons, yet it is obvious that it must be the first step toward anything resembling real progress, for no man can wholeheartedly enter upon the path until he has definitely decided to set his affection on things above, not on things on earth, and that decision comes from the certainty that nothing on earth is of any value in comparison with the higher life. This step is called by the Hindus the acquisition of viveka or discrimination, and Mr. Sinnett speaks of it as the surrender of allegiance to the higher self. Parikama, preparation for action. In this stage, the candidate learns to do the right thing simply because it is right, without regard to his own gain or loss either in this world or in the future, and acquires a perfect indifference to the enjoyment of the fruit of his own actions. This indifference is the natural result of the previous step, for when the neophyte has once realized the unreal and impermanent character of all earthly rewards, he ceases to crave for them. This higher indifference is called by the Hindus vairagya, upacharo, attention or conduct. At this stage, what are called the 6 qualifications, the shatsampati of the Hindus, must be acquired. These are called in Pali samo, stillness, that purity and calmness of thought which comes from perfect control of the mind, an extremely difficult qualification to attain, and yet very necessary, for unless the mind moves only in obedience to the guidance of the will, it cannot be a perfect instrument for the work of the master in the future. This qualification is very broad and includes in itself the self-mastery and calmness which were described in chapter 14 as necessary for astral work. B. Dharmo, subjugation, a similar mastery over, and therefore purity in, one's actions and words, a quality which again follows necessarily from its predecessor. C. Upati, cessation, explained as the cessation of fanaticism or belief in the necessity of any act or ceremony prescribed by a particular religion, thus leading the aspirant to independence of thought and a broad and generous tolerance. D. Titika, endurance or tolerance, by which is meant the willingness to bear cheerfully whatever one's karma may bring upon one, and to detach oneself from anything and everything worldly whenever necessary. It also includes the idea of complete absence of resentment of evil, man knowing that those who do him wrong are but the instruments of his own karma. E. Samadhana, steadfastness, oneness, which implies the inability to be diverted from one's path by temptation. This corresponds very closely with the steadfastness spoken of in the previous chapter. F. Sada, faith, confidence in the master and in oneself. Confidence, that is, that the master is a competent teacher, and that however unsure the pupil may feel of his own faculties, he still has within him that divine spark, which, when fanned into a flame, will enable him one day to attain even what his master has done. Thank you for loyally listening to 100 Books Collection. With your support, we are able to create more and more life-changing materials for every soul on earth.